The morning sky over Denver International Airport shimmered with the promise of another bustling day. Sunlight cascaded through the massive glass walls, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The terminal hummed with its familiar symphony, the rumble of rolling suitcases, the distant announcements echoing through speakers, the hurried footsteps of travelers racing against time, and the occasional laughter of children experiencing the wonder of flight. The lead departure boards flickered continuously, updating flight statuses with mechanical precision. Gates opened and closed like breathing lungs. Aircraft lined the tarmac in perfect rows, their metallic bodies gleaming under the Colorado sun. Inside the terminal, thousands of passengers moved like schools of fish, each following their own current toward their respective destinations. Among this sea of humanity walked a man who carried himself with quiet grace. He wore a hand-woven, cream-colored traditional African tunic, its intricate embroidery catching the light with subtle elegance. The fabric spoke of craftsmanship and heritage, each thread woven with purpose and meaning. His face reflected a profound calm, the kind that comes not from ignorance of the world's troubles but from deep understanding of them. This was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, though no one in the crowded terminal knew it. No security detail flanked his steps. No government motorcade awaited outside. No VIP escort rushed him through exclusive corridors. He had deliberately chosen to travel without the usual protocols, without the bubble of protection that typically surrounds heads of state. This was not recklessness, it was philosophy. He believed that a leader who could not walk among ordinary people had forgotten what it meant to serve them. In his right hand, he carried a brown leather briefcase, worn at the edges from years of use. Inside were documents that would shape his nation's future: defense agreements, educational reform proposals, diplomatic correspondence that could redirect millions in foreign aid. These papers represented hope for millions of his countrymen, children who might finally attend school, hospitals that might receive essential medicines, roads that could connect isolated villages to opportunity. Beside him rolled a Louis Vuitton suitcase, tasteful, modern, but unpretentious. Within its locked compartment lay a file that would determine Burkina Faso's educational and military budget for the next 6 months. These pages contained numbers that translated into real lives: teachers who would be hired, soldiers who would be equipped, programs that would be funded or abandoned. The weight of these decisions never left his mind, yet his expression revealed only serenity. Ibrahim moved through the security checkpoint with patience. He removed his shoes like everyone else, placed his briefcase in the gray plastic bin, and walked through the metal detector without ceremony. The TSA agent barely glanced at him, waving him through with the same mechanical gesture used 1,000 times that morning. No special treatment, no recognition, exactly as he wanted it. As he made his way to his gate, Ibrahim observed his fellow travelers. A young mother struggled with a crying infant while simultaneously managing 2 other small children. An elderly couple held hands, their weathered fingers intertwined as they navigated the unfamiliar terminal. A businessman barked into his phone about quarterly earnings, oblivious to the world around him. College students, backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughed at something on a shared phone screen. Each person carried their own story, their own burdens, their own hopes. Ibrahim understood this deeply. Leadership, he believed, was not about standing above people, but about standing among them, seeing them, honoring their humanity. This flight was more than transportation. It was a test of that philosophy, though he did not yet know how severely it would be tested. Continental Airways Flight 401 to New York's JFK Airport had earned its reputation as one of the world's premier first-class experiences. The cabin represented the pinnacle of aviation luxury, designed to make wealthy passengers forget they were even on an airplane. The first-class section contained 12 rows, each seat more akin to a private suite than mere seating. The leather was supple and butter-soft, sourced from Italian tanneries where craftsmen had perfected their trade over generations. Gold accent lighting ran along the cabin walls, creating an amber glow that suggested warmth and exclusivity. The air itself seemed different here, filtered, perfumed with subtle scents of sandalwood and vanilla, maintained at the perfect temperature and humidity. Wooden paneling adorned the walls, each piece carefully selected for its grain pattern and finished with multiple coats of hand-rubbed oil. The panels reflected the soft lighting in such a way that the cabin resembled an elegant library more than an aircraft. Overhead compartments closed with barely a whisper. The carpet beneath passengers' feet was so plush that footsteps made no sound. Individual entertainment screens offered hundreds of movies, television shows, and music selections. Each seat featured a full recline function, converting into a lie-flat bed complete with luxury linens. Side tables were inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Reading lights could be adjusted to precise angles. The seats even had massage functions, offering weary travelers relief from the stresses of their important lives. The passenger manifest for first class that day read like a who's who of success and privilege. In seat 3A sat Marcus Wellington, a Wall Street banker whose firm had just closed $1 billion merger. He wore a Brioni suit that cost more than most people earned in 3 months and checked his Patek Philippe watch repeatedly, as if commanding time itself to move faster. The Wall Street Journal lay open across his lap, though he'd read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it, his mind already calculating the next deal. In seat 1B, elderly Mrs. Alina Whitmore worked her knitting needles with practiced precision. She wore a navy blue cardigan she'd knitted herself and pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She was traveling to visit her great-grandchildren for the first time, her face occasionally breaking into a soft smile as she imagined holding them. Despite her first-class ticket, a gift from her successful son, she maintained the humble demeanor of her Midwestern upbringing. Seat 4A held Diego Martinez, a Hispanic father traveling with his 8-year-old daughter Sofia. Diego had worked 2 jobs for 5 years to afford this trip, a promise he'd made to his late wife that he would take their daughter to see the Statue of Liberty. Sofia pressed her face against the window, counting clouds and asking endless questions with the wonder that only children possess. Her father answered each one patiently, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Around them sat corporate executives, wealthy retirees, a celebrated surgeon, a tech entrepreneur, and various others whom the world deemed worthy of first-class treatment. They had all paid substantial sums, or had their companies pay for the privilege of these seats. They expected impeccable service, absolute comfort, and the intangible but vital sense that they belonged in this exclusive space. Ibrahim Traoré settled into seat 2A next to the window. He organized his briefcase carefully, placing it under the seat in front of him in precise compliance with airline regulations. His movements were economical and purposeful. He glanced out the window at the tarmac, watching ground crews efficiently load luggage, refuel the aircraft, and perform their pre-flight checks. The ballet of airport operations fascinated him, so many people working in coordination to make flight possible. He thought about the week ahead. The international conference in New York would bring together world leaders, economic advisors, and development experts. He would present Burkina Faso's new agricultural initiatives, lobby for fair trade agreements, and attempt to secure funding for rural electrification projects. The stakes were enormous, but his face betrayed none of this pressure. He simply breathed, centered himself, and prepared for the journey. The other first-class passengers barely noticed him. Why would they? He wore no expensive suit, no flashy watch, no obvious markers of wealth or power. His tunic, while beautifully made, looked to their untrained eyes like simple ethnic clothing. His manner was quiet and unassuming. In a cabin full of people accustomed to announcing their importance, his humility made him invisible. The flight attendants began their pre-flight rounds, offering champagne and warm towels to first-class passengers. They moved with choreographed efficiency, smiling professionally, anticipating needs before passengers articulated them. The cabin filled with the gentle murmur of polite conversation, the rustle of newspapers, and the ambient sounds of an aircraft preparing for departure. None of them, not the passengers, not the crew, not even the pilots in the cockpit, had any idea that this ordinary-seeming flight was about to become extraordinary. That within this metal tube at 30,000 feet, the collision between prejudice and dignity would create a moment that would echo around the world. The engines began their low rumble, a sound that frequent travelers barely noticed anymore. Seat belt signs illuminated. Flight attendants took their positions. And in that moment before takeoff, when everything still seemed routine, the stage was set for a transformation. Jessica Hartwell had been a flight attendant for 8 years. She joined Continental Airways fresh out of college, drawn by the promise of travel, good benefits, and the glamorous image Hat Airlines still somehow projected despite the reality of the work. Those 8 years had been a mixture of experiences. She'd served celebrities, dealt with drunk passengers, comforted nervous flyers, and handled medical emergencies. She'd also developed certain assumptions about people, judgments made in seconds based on appearance, accent, and behavior. Today, she was assigned to first class, a position that came with both prestige and pressure. First-class passengers expected perfection. They noticed every detail and complained when standards slipped. Jessica had learned to project absolute confidence, to speak with authority, and to maintain control of her cabin. Sometimes that confidence crossed into arrogance. Sometimes that authority became rigidity. She entered the first-class cabin with her characteristic posture, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, expression professionally pleasant but with an edge that warned passengers not to make trouble. Her uniform was immaculate, not a thread out of place. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Her makeup was applied with precision, though perhaps a bit heavy-handed, as if she were wearing armor rather than cosmetics. Her eyes scanned the cabin, performing the quick assessment she'd perfected over years. Check seat belts, identify potential problems, note who might need extra attention, register who looked like they might cause issues. Her gaze moved from the banker with his newspaper to the elderly lady with her knitting to the Hispanic father and his daughter. Then her eyes landed on Ibrahim Traoré in seat 2A. Something hardened in her expression. Here in this exclusive cabin sat a black man in African clothing. His presence jarred against her internal image of who belonged in first class. Her mind, conditioned by years of unconscious bias and the implicit prejudices of her upbringing, immediately questioned, how did he afford this? Is his ticket legitimate? Does he actually belong here? These thoughts occurred so quickly, so automatically, that she barely recognized them as prejudice. To her, they felt like legitimate professional concerns. After all, she was responsible for maintaining standards, wasn't she? She was protecting the comfort of the other passengers, wasn't she? She was simply doing her job, wasn't she? These rationalizations came easily because they'd been constructed over a lifetime of subtle messages. From media representations, from casual comments by family and friends, from the structural inequalities that shaped her world but remained largely invisible to her. She'd never considered herself racist. She would have been offended by the suggestion. Yet here she stood, staring at Ibrahim with suspicion born from nothing but the color of his skin and the cut of his clothing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone service workers use when they're being superficially polite while conveying deep disrespect. "Your luggage appears to be improperly stored. First-class passengers are expected to know and follow regulations." Ibrahim looked up calmly. His eyes held no anger, no fear, just a quiet awareness that something was beginning, though he didn't yet know its full shape. "The bag is stored exactly according to regulations," he replied gently. "It fits completely under the seat and isn't blocking any aisles." His response was perfectly reasonable, his tone measured and respectful. But Jessica had already decided this was a confrontation she needed to win. In her mind, his pushback, no matter how polite, represented a challenge to her authority. And her authority, she believed, was absolute in this cabin. "Sir, I've been doing this job for 8 years. I think I know the regulations better than you do." Her voice had grown sharper, louder. Other passengers were beginning to notice the exchange, looking up from their papers and phones. "I'm sure you do know the regulations," Ibrahim said, maintaining his composed demeanor. "And I believe my bag complies with them. Perhaps we could." He didn't finish the sentence. Jessica stepped forward, and with a deliberate motion that shocked everyone watching, kicked his Louis Vuitton suitcase with the toe of her boot. The bag toppled onto its side and slid across the carpeted aisle, coming to rest several rows back. The impact caused the suitcase to partially open. Papers burst forth like startled birds, diplomatic documents, confidential reports, educational policy proposals, letters bearing official seals. They scattered across the first-class cabin, some sliding under seats, others fluttering through the air before settling on the plush carpet. One particularly important folder landed face up, revealing the seal of the president's office, though no one was close enough to read it clearly yet. The cabin fell into stunned silence. The ambient sounds of the aircraft, the air circulation system, the distant engine noise, suddenly seemed deafening in the absence of human sound. Mrs. Whitmore's knitting needles stopped mid-stitch. Marcus Wellington lowered his newspaper completely. Diego instinctively pulled Sophia closer, covering her eyes with his hand as if to shield her from what was unfolding. Everyone recognized what they'd just witnessed, not just a violation of customer service standards, but a profound act of disrespect. The physicality of the kick, the deliberate nature of it, the public humiliation, it was shocking in its brazenness. Ibrahim sat completely still for 3 long seconds. His hands remained on the armrests. His breathing stayed even. His face showed no emotion, not because he felt none, but because he had learned through years of leadership during turbulent times that reaction must follow thought, not precede it. He was angry, certainly. He was hurt, absolutely. But he was also aware that this moment was bigger than his personal feelings. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his feet with quiet dignity. At 6 feet tall, he had a commanding presence, but he carried it without aggression. He moved past Jessica without looking at her and knelt down where his papers lay scattered. One by one, he began collecting them. His movements were deliberate and graceful. He smoothed each page carefully before placing it back in order. When he reached for a document that had slid under seat 5C, the passenger there, a young tech entrepreneur, bent down to help retrieve it. Their eyes met briefly, and Ibrahim nodded his thanks. The entrepreneur noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, though whether from anger or emotion, he couldn't tell. As Ibrahim gathered his papers, Jessica stood over him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous certainty. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again," she announced loudly. "And your identification, and I want to examine that suitcase. It looks suspicious to me." The word suspicious hung in the air. Everyone knew what she really meant. Not suspicious because of anything concrete, suspicious because of who was holding it. The racism implicit in her demand became suddenly explicit to every other passenger, though Jessica herself still seemed unaware of it. "I've already shown you my boarding pass during boarding," Ibrahim said quietly, still kneeling on the floor with papers in his hands. "My identification is in my briefcase, which I'd be happy to retrieve, but I'd like to know specifically what appears suspicious to you about my luggage." His reasonableness made Jessica's hostility even more apparent. She was spoiling for a fight, and his refusal to give her one seemed to make her angrier. "Just being from Burkina Faso isn't enough to qualify for first class," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "These seats are for people who have actually accomplished something with their lives, not people who look like they wandered onto the wrong plane." A collective gasp went through the cabin. The mask was off now. This wasn't about luggage placement or regulation compliance. This was about race, about prejudice, about the assumption that a black African man in traditional clothing couldn't possibly belong in a space reserved for successful people, a category that, in Jessica's mind, apparently didn't include anyone who looked like Ibrahim. Mrs. Whitmore set down her knitting with a sharp motion. "Young lady," she said, her elderly voice carrying surprising steel, "I've lived through the civil rights movement, and I recognize prejudice when I see it. What you're doing is shameful." Jessica whirled on her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm trying to maintain standards in this cabin. I don't need passengers interfering with my job." "Your job is customer service," Marcus Wellington interjected, surprising himself with his intervention. He'd been content to ignore the situation initially, but something about Jessica's blatant discrimination had penetrated his usual self-absorption. "This isn't service. This is harassment." "He could have stolen that suitcase," Jessica shot back, grasping at justifications. "That's a very expensive bag. How do we know it's his?" Diego Martinez slowly took out his phone. His daughter Sophia whispered, "Daddy, why is she being mean to him?" "Because some people," Diego said softly but clearly enough for others to hear, "let the small amount of power they have corrupt them. They forget that kindness costs nothing." His words seemed to echo through the cabin. Several passengers nodded. One or two looked away uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own past silences in the face of injustice. Ibrahim had finished collecting his papers. He stood up, holding the stack carefully, and returned to his seat. He did not argue further with Jessica. He did not call for a supervisor. He simply sat down, placed his documents back in his briefcase, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if in prayer or meditation. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, charged with moral weight. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something significant, though they didn't yet understand its full dimensions. Jessica, perhaps sensing she'd gone too far but unable to back down without losing face, made one final demand. "Show me your passport again, right now, and I want to see proof you can afford this seat. Credit cards, bank statements, something that proves you're not here by mistake or fraud." Ibrahim opened his eyes. He looked directly at Jessica for the first time, and she flinched slightly at what she saw there, not anger, but something more powerful, disappointment. The look of someone who had hoped for better from his fellow humans and been let down once again. "If my identity is truly what concerns you," he said quietly, Then you're not ready for the truth. The confrontation had been building for nearly 15 minutes now, though it felt like hours. The air in the cabin had become thick with tension, uncomfortable and close despite the air conditioning running at full capacity. Every passenger sat on edge, watching, waiting to see how this would resolve. Jessica had moved toward the intercom phone mounted near the galley, clearly preparing to call the captain and request that Ibrahim be removed from the flight. Her hand was actually reaching for the receiver when Ibrahim made a small gesture, just a slight movement of his hand toward his briefcase. "Before you make that call," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin, "there is something I should show you." He opened his briefcase with deliberate slowness. From an interior pocket, he withdrew a simple white business card. The card itself was unremarkable, elegant but understated, with no excessive embellishment. But the gold-embossed text on it carried weight that no amount of decoration could add. Ibrahim stood and walked the few steps to where Jessica stood by the galley. He held out the card to her. She took it reluctantly, her expression skeptical, as if expecting some kind of trick. She looked down at the card, her eyes widened. The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands, holding the card, began to tremble visibly. The card read, "Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso." Below the name and title was the official seal of the presidency, embossed in gold, impossible to fake. Contact information followed, an office address in Ouagadougou, an official email, a government phone number. The card slipped from Jessica's fingers and fluttered to the floor. For perhaps 10 seconds, no one moved. The revelation was so shocking, so completely unexpected, that it seemed to paralyze everyone. A head of state. A president. Here on this commercial flight, traveling alone in first class, and he'd just been publicly humiliated, accused of theft, and treated with contempt. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to react. She stood up from her seat, her elderly frame straightening with dignity. "My God," she whispered, "we just watched a president be treated like a criminal." Marcus Wellington ran his hand through his hair, his face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. "I've traveled all over the world," he said to no one in particular. "I've never seen anything like this." Diego was recording. His phone had been capturing everything since the moment Jessica kicked the suitcase. He'd been subtle about it, holding the phone low, but now he raised it slightly, making sure to get clear footage of Jessica's reaction and the card on the floor. "Daddy," Sophia said, her young voice cutting through the adult silence, "is he really a president, like the president from my books?" "Yes, sweetheart," Diego replied, his voice thick with emotion. "He's really a president, and he just taught us all something about grace under pressure." Jessica bent down and picked up the card with shaking hands. She looked at it again, as if hoping it would say something different the second time. It didn't. She looked up at Ibrahim, her face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of what she'd done. Ibrahim stood calmly, his hands at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. "You asked for my credentials, there they are. But understand this, the problem was never that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you judged me based on what I looked like, where I came from, and what I was wearing. You demanded proof of my worthiness to occupy a seat I'd paid for, proof you wouldn't have demanded from anyone else in this cabin." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around him, passengers were pulling out their own phones, some texting others, some searching online to verify Ibrahim's identity. Within seconds, they found articles about the Burkina president, photographs confirming that this was indeed him, news stories about his reforms and international diplomatic efforts. "You say these seats are for people who have accomplished something," Ibrahim continued. "I've led a nation through economic crisis. I've negotiated peace agreements. I've built schools and hospitals. I've represented my people on the world stage, but none of that should matter. I deserved basic respect not because of my title, but because I'm a human being. That's a lesson you still need to learn." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Someone started clapping. It was Mrs. Whitmore. Others joined in. Soon, most of the first-class cabin was applauding, not loudly or aggressively, but with the kind of appreciation people show when they witness something important, when they see dignity triumph over disrespect. Jessica stood frozen, the card still in her trembling hand. Tears began to stream down her face, tears of shame, of fear for her job, of the sudden terrible realization of what her prejudice had led her to do. She'd humiliated a head of state, certainly. But more than that, she'd revealed the ugliest parts of herself in front of dozens of witnesses, and now that revelation was being recorded, shared, about to spread beyond this cabin to the entire world. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Robert Mitchell stepped into the first-class cabin. He was a veteran pilot in his 50s with gray hair and a commanding presence. He took in the scene quickly, the scattered papers now mostly collected, the crying flight attendant, the calm African man standing in the aisle, and the expressions on the passengers' faces. "Someone want to explain to me what's happening in my cabin?" he asked. Multiple passengers began speaking at once. Diego held up his phone, where the video was paused on a frame showing Jessica kicking the suitcase. "Captain, you need to see this." For the next 5 minutes, Captain Mitchell watched Diego's recording. His expression grew progressively grimmer. When it finished, he looked at Jessica with barely contained anger, then at Ibrahim with profound apology in his eyes. "Mr. President," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "on behalf of Continental Airways, I offer my deepest apologies for this disgraceful treatment. This should never have happened. I assure you there will be consequences." Ibrahim nodded slowly. "Captain, I appreciate your words, but I want you to understand something. This isn't about punishment. This is about learning. Your crew member revealed something that exists in many hearts: fear of difference, assumptions based on appearance, the casual cruelty that comes from unchecked privilege. If this incident results only in her being fired, then we've learned nothing." The wisdom in his words struck everyone who heard them. Here was a man who had every right to demand retribution, yet he was asking for something harder: real change, genuine understanding. Captain Mitchell looked at Ibrahim with new respect. "Sir, may I ask why you chose to travel this way, without security, without your staff?" Ibrahim smiled slightly. "Because a leader who cannot walk among ordinary people is not truly leading. I wanted to understand how the world treats those without power, without recognition. Now I understand it very well." The captain nodded slowly, then turned to Jessica. "You're suspended effective immediately. You'll be escorted off this plane as soon as we return to the gate, and you'll be hearing from HR within 24 hours. As Jessica was led away, still crying, still clutching Ibrahim's business card as if it were evidence in her own trial, the passengers began to settle back into their seats. But nothing was the same. The cabin that had seemed so exclusive, so privileged, now felt different, smaller somehow, as if its walls had been exposed as paper-thin. The flight was delayed 2 hours while paperwork was filed, and a replacement flight attendant was brought on board. During that time, several passengers approached Ibrahim, apologizing for not intervening sooner, thanking him for his grace under pressure, asking to take photos with him, which he politely but firmly declined. When the plane finally took off, climbing into the bright Colorado sky and banking east toward New York, Ibrahim sat by his window and looked out at the clouds. He had a speech to write for the conference, documents to review, calls to make. But for the moment, he simply sat in silence, processing what had happened. He was not naive enough to believe this one incident would change everything. Prejudice was old and deep-rooted. But perhaps, just perhaps, the story of what happened on Flight 401 would make a few people think twice before judging others. Perhaps it would embolden others to speak up when they witnessed injustice. Perhaps it would remind people that dignity is not determined by position or appearance, but by character. That, he thought, would be worth far more than any apology. By the time Flight 401 landed at JFK, the world already knew. Diego's video had uploaded successfully despite the in-flight Wi-Fi restrictions. He'd posted it to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram simultaneously with a simple caption: "A president treated like a criminal, racism at 30,000 feet." Within minutes, it began to spread. Within an hour, it had thousands of shares. By the time the plane landed, it had millions. The footage was damning. The kick to the suitcase was clearly visible. Jessica's escalating hostility was undeniable. Ibrahim's calm responses and quiet dignity created a stark contrast that made the injustice even more apparent. And the moment of revelation, when Jessica saw the business card and the truth came crashing down, was captured in clear detail. News outlets around the world picked up the story. CNN ran it with the headline, "African President Faces Racist Treatment on U.S. Flight." BBC featured it under "Dignity Under Fire," the president who refused to fight back. Al Jazeera's coverage focused on the broader implications for how people of color are treated in Western spaces. In Burkina Faso, the response was immediate and emotional. People poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, not in protest exactly, but in solidarity with their president. They held signs reading, "We stand with Traoré and dignity cannot be stolen." Some wept openly, hurt by the disrespect shown to their leader but proud of how he'd handled it. Radio stations played his speeches on repeat. Television channels ran special programs analyzing the incident. Social media exploded with commentary. President Traoré trended worldwide. Respect not racism became a rallying cry. People shared their own stories of discrimination, of times they'd been judged by their appearance, of moments when they'd been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. Activists praised Ibrahim's response. "This is how you resist," wrote one prominent civil rights leader. "Not with violence, not with anger, but with unwavering dignity that exposes injustice for what it is." Others focused on the systemic nature of what had happened. "This wasn't one bad flight attendant," argued a sociologist in a viral Twitter thread. "This was the culmination of centuries of racism, colonialism, and the assumption that black and brown people are inherently less worthy. If this can happen to a president, imagine what happens to regular people every single day." Continental Airways found itself in crisis mode. Their phones rang constantly, journalists seeking comment, angry customers threatening boycotts, business partners expressing concern. The company's stock price dipped. Hashtags like Boycott Continental started gaining traction. The airline's CEO, Margaret Chen, called an emergency board meeting. They had to respond and respond quickly. But what could they say? The video was clear. The facts were undeniable. One of their employees had committed an act of blatant racial discrimination against a head of state in front of dozens of witnesses, and it was all on camera. After hours of discussion, they issued a statement. Continental Airways is horrified and deeply ashamed of the treatment President Ibrahim Traoré received on Flight 401. This behavior is inexcusable and does not reflect our values or standards. We have suspended the employee involved pending a full investigation. We are implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all staff immediately. We have reached out to President Traoré to offer our sincerest apologies and to discuss how we can make this right. We understand that actions speak louder than words, and we are committed to fundamental changes in how we operate. It was a good statement, professionally crafted and appropriately contrite, but words alone wouldn't be enough, and everyone knew it. The legal proceedings moved surprisingly quickly. Jessica Hartwell was not just fired, she was charged with assault for kicking the suitcase, with harassment, and with violating civil rights laws. The case became a legal landmark, one of the first times a service worker's racism was prosecuted criminally rather than just handled as an employment issue. The trial took place 3 months after the incident. The courtroom was packed with media, activists, legal scholars, and curious observers. Security was tight. Outside, supporters of both sides gathered, those who saw Jessica as a scapegoat for systemic racism she'd merely acted out, and those who saw her as justly facing consequences for her actions. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They played Diego's video in court, and the jury watched in silence. The physical assault on the suitcase was clear. The racial animus in Jessica's words was undeniable. The escalating pattern of discrimination was evident. Then came the witness testimony. Mrs. Whitmore took the stand, her voice steady despite her age. "I've lived 83 years, she said. I marched in Selma. I've seen the best and worst of humanity. What I witnessed on that flight was pure prejudice, irrational, cruel, and completely unwarranted. That young woman made assumptions asked solely on the color of the president's skin, and decided he didn't belong. When he proved her wrong at every turn, she only became angrier. That tells you everything you need to know." Marcus Wellington testified next, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit as he admitted, "I almost didn't say anything. I wanted to ignore it, pretend it wasn't my problem. But I couldn't. What she was doing was so obviously wrong that silence felt like complicity. I regret not speaking up sooner." Diego Martinez brought his daughter Sofia to testify. The judge was initially hesitant to allow such a young child, but Sofia insisted she wanted to speak. She sat in the witness chair, her feet barely reaching the ground, and said in a clear voice, "The lady was mean for no reason. The president man was nice. He didn't yell or anything, even when she was being so mean. My daddy says that's what being strong really means, being kind even when others aren't." Her testimony brought tears to several jurors' eyes. The innocence of her observation cut through all the legal complexity to expose the simple moral truth at the heart of the case. Finally, Ibrahim himself took the stand. He spoke calmly and clearly, describing the events without exaggeration or emotion. "I was treated as suspicious solely because of my appearance," he said. "I complied with every request. I remained polite throughout, yet I was physically assaulted, publicly humiliated, and threatened with removal from a seat I had legally purchased. This was not a misunderstanding or an honest mistake. This was racism, pure and simple." The defense attorney tried to argue that Jessica had been following protocols, that she had legitimate security concerns, that she'd been having a bad day and made poor decisions under stress. But the video undermined every argument. The jury could see for themselves that no security concerns existed, that no protocols justified her behavior, that her treatment of Ibrahim was qualitatively different from how she'd treated every other passenger. The verdict came back after just 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. The judge, an African-American woman named Sandra Hayes, who had herself experienced discrimination throughout her legal career, addressed the courtroom with measured gravity. "This case represents more than one individual's actions," Judge Hayes began, her voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "It represents a pattern of behavior that has persisted for far too long in our society. The assumption that certain people do not belong in certain spaces simply because of the color of their skin or their cultural background." She turned to face Jessica, who sat at the defense table with her head bowed, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Ms. Hartwell, you have been found guilty of assault, harassment, and civil rights violations. These are serious charges that carry serious consequences. But before I pass sentence, I want you to understand something. You are not merely being punished for what you did to President Traoré. You are being held accountable for participating in a system of oppression that has harmed countless people who never had the platform or the power to demand justice." Jessica looked up, her face streaked with tears, mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Judge Hayes continued, "I sentence you to 6 months in jail, suspended pending completion of 500 hours of community service working with immigrant and refugee communities. You will also undergo comprehensive anti-racism training and counseling. Additionally, you are required to write a public letter of apology, not a corporate statement crafted by lawyers, but your own words, expressing genuine understanding of what you did and why it was wrong." The sentence drew mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient, that 6 months suspended for such a public act of racism sent the wrong message. Others argued it was too harsh, that Jessica had already lost her job, her reputation, and any chance of working in her profession again. But Judge Hayes had struck a balance between punishment and rehabilitation, between justice and the possibility of redemption. The months following the trial brought changes that no one had fully anticipated. Continental Airways didn't just implement anti-bias training, they completely restructured their hiring and training processes. They established a diversity and inclusion department with real power and substantial budget. They created an anonymous reporting system for discriminatory behavior. They partnered with civil rights organizations to audit their practices and hold them accountable. But the changes went far beyond one airline. The incident sparked a broader conversation about how service industries treat people of color, particularly those from African nations. Hotels began reviewing their policies. Restaurants examined their seating practices. Retail stores looked at how their security staff profiled customers. The United Nations invited Ibrahim to deliver a keynote address on dignity and discrimination. He stood before the assembled nations and spoke not with anger, but with the same quiet power he displayed on the airplane. "What happened to me on that flight happens to millions of people every day," he said, his voice echoing through the Grand Assembly Hall. "The only difference is that I had a title that eventually protected me, that forced people to pay attention. But what about the young black student who is followed through a store? What about the brown-skinned traveler who is always randomly selected for additional screening? What about the African immigrant who is assumed to be poor, uneducated, or dangerous, simply because of where they come from?" He paused, letting his questions hang in the air. Delegates from nations around the world sat in attentive silence, many nodding in recognition. Dignity is not something that should be reserved for presidents and prime ministers. It is not a privilege to be earned. It is a fundamental human right that belongs to every person, regardless of their race, nationality, religion, or social status. Until we build systems and cultures that protect that dignity universally, we have failed in our most basic human obligation to one another. The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it inspired action. Several nations proposed new anti-discrimination legislation. International organizations developed new training protocols. Universities created new courses examining implicit bias and systemic racism. Jessica Hartwell's story did not end with her conviction and sentencing. In many ways, that was just the beginning. The community service Judge Hayes had assigned her proved transformative in ways Jessica never expected. She was assigned to work at a refugee resettlement center in Brooklyn, helping newly arrived families navigate American systems, housing applications, job searches, school enrollment, medical care. At first, Jessica approached the work with resentment. She felt victimized, as if she was being unfairly punished for what she still viewed as just doing her job. She completed her hours mechanically, doing the minimum required, counting down the days until she'd fulfilled her obligation. But something shifted about 3 months into her service. She met a family from Somalia, a mother named Amina and her 3 children who had fled violence and spent years in refugee camps before finally being resettled in America. Amina spoke limited English, but possessed a quiet determination that reminded Jessica of someone, though she couldn't initially place who. Jessica was helping Amina fill out job applications when the woman's youngest son, barely 6 years old, showed Jessica a drawing he'd made. It depicted an airplane, the symbol of their escape and new beginning. The boy smiled up at Jessica with complete trust, innocent and hopeful. In that moment, Jessica saw him, really saw him, not as a refugee or a case file or an assignment, but as a child who had survived more trauma than she could imagine, who still found joy in simple things, who looked at her, a stranger with openness and faith. And suddenly, she remembered. President Traoré had looked at her with that same fundamental trust when he first boarded the plane, before she destroyed it with her prejudice and assumptions. He had extended his humanity to her, and she had responded with cruelty. Jessica excused herself and went to the bathroom. She stood in front of the mirror and wept, not the performative tears she'd cried in court, not tears of self-pity, but deep, wrenching sobs of genuine remorse and dawning understanding. She had been given power, the small power of a flight attendant, certainly, but power nonetheless, and she had wielded it carelessly, cruelly, guided by assumptions she'd never questioned. How many other passengers had she subtly mistreated over the years? How many times had she made someone feel unwelcome, judged lesser? She'd never considered these questions before. She'd been sleepwalking through life, operating on autopilot, never examining her own biases. When she returned to help Amina, something had fundamentally changed. She began to listen differently, to see differently, to engage differently. She started arriving early to the center and staying late. She learned phrases in Somali, Arabic, French, the languages of the families she served. She celebrated their victories and grieved their setbacks as if they were her own. One evening, 6 months into her community service, Jessica sat down and wrote her letter of apology. It was not the carefully crafted statement her lawyer had suggested. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. Dear President Traoré, I have spent months trying to understand how I became the person who treated you with such disrespect on that flight. I could make excuses. That I was having a bad day, that I felt stressed, that I didn't understand who you were. But the truth is simpler and more painful. I was racist. I didn't think of myself that way. I would have denied it vehemently if anyone had accused me. But my actions spoke louder than my self-perception. I saw a black man in African clothing, and I immediately assumed he didn't belong, that he couldn't afford that seat, that he was somehow suspicious or fraudulent. I made these judgments in seconds, without evidence, based purely on your appearance. What haunts me most is not just what I did to you, though that is terrible enough, but what I must have done to countless others over the years without even realizing it. How many people did I make feel unwelcome? How many times did I communicate, through subtle actions or tone, that someone didn't belong? How much casual cruelty did I inflict while believing I was simply doing my job well? I cannot undo what I did. I cannot erase your humiliation or the pain I caused. But I can promise you this. I am not the same person who kicked your suitcase across that cabin. Working with refugees and immigrants, people who have survived unimaginable hardships, who show incredible courage and resilience every single day, has taught me what dignity really means. It's what you showed me on that flight. the strength to maintain your humanity even when others try to strip it away. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that your grace in that terrible moment planted a seed that is finally beginning to grow. I am learning to see people, really see them, as individuals deserving of respect, not categories to be judged. You said this was about learning, not punishment. You were right. And I am learning, slowly and painfully, to be a better human being. With deepest regret and growing understanding. Jessica Hartwell. She published the letter on social media, knowing it would subject her to fresh waves of criticism and mockery. And it did. Thousands of comments condemned her, questioned her sincerity, dismissed her apology as too little too late. But there were also messages from others who saw something genuine in her words, people who admitted their own struggles with implicit bias, individuals who said her honesty gave them courage to examine their own prejudices. Ibrahim saw the letter. He did not respond publicly, but he forwarded it to Judge Hayes with a brief note. Perhaps there is hope after all. Ibrahim arrived at the United Nations Conference on International Development with the weight of expectation on his shoulders. The incident on the plane had made him a global figure, a symbol of dignity in the face of racism. But he had not come to New York to be a symbol. He had come to fight for his country's future. The conference room was filled with world leaders, development experts, representatives from the World Bank and IMF, heads of NGOs. These were the people who decided which nations received aid, which projects got funded, which countries were seen as worthy of investment. For years, Burkina Faso had struggled to be heard in these spaces. Western powers often viewed African nations through a lens of pity or paternalism, places to be saved rather than partners to be respected. Ibrahim had always pushed back against this narrative, but it was an uphill battle. Now everything was different. When he entered the conference room, people stood. Delegates who might have ignored him before approached to shake his hand, to express their admiration, to apologize for any past dismissals. The incident on the plane had done what years of diplomatic efforts could not. It had forced the world to see him, really see him, as a leader deserving of respect. But Ibrahim understood the danger in this too. He did not want to be respected only because his humiliation had gone viral, only because he'd become a social media sensation. He wanted respect based on substance, on the real work Burkina Faso was doing, the genuine progress his nation was making. When his turn came to present, Ibrahim stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. He could have used this moment to talk about the plane incident, to leverage his newfound fame. Instead, he chose a different path. "Thank you all for your attention," he began. "I know many of you are here because of what happened on Flight 401. That incident has given me a platform I did not seek but will not waste. However, I'm not here to talk about discrimination. I'm here to talk about development. I'm here to discuss how nations like mine can build sustainable economies, improve education and healthcare, and create opportunities for our young people." He clicked to his first slide, which showed not a picture of himself or the viral video, but data on Burkina Faso's agricultural innovations. In the past 2 years, we have increased crop yields by 35% through sustainable farming techniques developed by Burkinabe scientists. We did this not with large foreign aid packages, but with local knowledge, traditional practices combined with modern science, and trust in our own people's capabilities. For the next 45 minutes, Ibrahim laid out a comprehensive vision for African development, one based not on dependency or charity, but on partnership and mutual respect. He challenged the traditional aid model, arguing that what African nations needed was not handouts but fair trade agreements, technology transfer, and an end to the structural inequalities that kept them poor. "The world saw my dignity tested on that airplane," he said in conclusion. "But the dignity of nations is tested every day in rooms like this one, when we are talked about rather than talked with, when decisions affecting millions of our people are made without our meaningful input, when we are treated as problems to be solved rather than partners to be engaged." He paused, making eye contact with delegates from various nations. "The flight attendant who mistreated me made assumptions based on appearance. I wonder, how often do international institutions make similar assumptions about African nations based on our GDP, our colonial histories, our challenges? How often is our potential dismissed because we don't fit someone's narrow definition of who deserves respect, investment, or partnership?" The room fell silent. Ibrahim had taken a personal incident and transformed it into a broader critique of global power dynamics, forcing powerful nations to examine their own biases and assumptions. When he finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained. But more importantly, in the days that followed, several nations approached him with genuine interest in the partnerships he'd proposed. Trade agreements were initiated. Technology sharing arrangements were discussed. The narrative began to shift, slowly, imperfectly, but noticeably. A year after the incident on Flight 401, the world looked subtly different. Continental Airways had become an industry leader in diversity and inclusion, not because they wanted good publicity, but because they'd undergone genuine institutional change. They'd hired consultants from marginalized communities to help redesign their training. They'd promoted several employees of color to leadership positions. They'd established partnerships with organizations fighting discrimination. Jessica Hartwell had completed her community service and her mandated training. She'd also done something unexpected. She'd enrolled in college to study social work, specifically focused on refugee and immigrant support services. The work that had begun as punishment had become her calling. She would never work as a flight attendant again, but she'd found a new path, one where her hard-learned lessons could actually help others. She occasionally gave talks at diversity training sessions, speaking honestly about her journey from unconscious racism to painful awakening. Her message was simple but powerful. I didn't think I was racist. That was the problem. I'd absorbed centuries of bias without ever examining it, and I let it guide my actions. Changing required me to get uncomfortable, to confront ugly truths about myself, to listen to people whose experiences I'd dismissed. It's ongoing work. I'm still learning. But at least now I'm aware enough to question my assumptions, to pause before judging, to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. Her talks were not always well received. Some people dismissed her as performative, accused her of profiting from her racism. Others appreciated her honesty, seeing in her journey the possibility of genuine change. Both responses were valid. Redemption was complicated, messy, and never guaranteed. Ibrahim had returned to Burkina Faso, where he continued the challenging work of governance. The incident had raised his international profile, which translated into some real benefits: more favorable trade terms, increased foreign investment, greater attention to his nation's needs. But he remained focused on the substance of leadership rather than its symbolism. He never forgot the lessons of Flight 401, though. In cabinet meetings, he would sometimes say, "Remember the airplane principle," his shorthand for the idea that true character reveals itself not when people know who you are, but when they think you're nobody. He applied this principle to how his government treated ordinary citizens, how his officials behaved when they thought no one important was watching, how his nation engaged with those who had less power. Diego Martinez and his daughter Sofia had become minor celebrities in their community. The video Diego recorded had sparked important conversations, but what people remembered most was Sofia's testimony, her childlike clarity cutting through adult complications. Diego had been offered money for interviews, for rights to the footage, for a book deal. He declined everything, saying simply, "This wasn't about me, it was about doing what was right. You don't profit from that." Mrs. Whitmore had passed away peacefully in her sleep 8 months after the incident, surrounded by her grandchildren. At her funeral, her son read a letter she'd written to be opened after her death. "I lived through the civil rights movement. I saw people suffer and die for equality. I thought by the time I died, we'd be further along than we are. But if my last act of courage was standing up on that airplane, calling out injustice when I saw it, then I can rest easy." Change happens not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small moments when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. Be those people. Marcus Wellington, the Wall Street banker, had made an unexpected change in his life. The incident had forced him to recognize how often he'd looked away from injustice, prioritizing his own comfort over moral courage. He'd established a foundation that provided scholarships specifically for African students pursuing education in economics and finance, with a goal of diversifying the field that had made him wealthy. It was a small thing, perhaps, one man trying to make amends for years of indifference, but it was something. Exactly 1 year after the incident, Continental Airways arranged a ceremony. They'd invited Ibrahim to return, offering him and his family first-class tickets anywhere in the world, a gesture of apology and respect. Ibrahim had initially declined, seeing no need to revisit that painful moment, but his advisors convinced him that the gesture, if handled properly, could be meaningful. The ceremony took place at Denver International Airport in the same terminal where everything had begun. The airline had set up a small stage near the departure gates. Media was present, but kept at a respectful distance. Security was professional but unobtrusive. Ibrahim arrived wearing another traditional tunic, this one in deep blue with gold threading. He walked through the terminal, and this time people recognized him. Travelers stopped to watch, to applaud, to nod respectfully. Some asked for photos, which he politely declined, explaining he was there for an important event. The CEO of Continental Airways, Margaret Chen, spoke first. "1 year ago in this very terminal, we failed. We failed President Traoré, we failed our values, and we failed the trust that passengers place in us when they fly. What happened should never have happened, and we cannot change that. But we can change how we operate going forward." She announced several new initiatives: partnerships with civil rights organizations, a scholarship fund for students studying international relations and cultural understanding, and the renaming of their Diversity and Inclusion Department to the Dignity Initiative, a direct reference to Ibrahim's response to the incident. Then she did something unexpected. "I'd like to invite someone to join us on stage. Many of you may recognize her. Jessica Hartwell was the flight attendant whose actions precipitated this crisis. She has asked to be here today, and President Traoré agreed to her presence. Jessica, would you join us?" A collective gasp went through the crowd. Jessica walked slowly to the stage, her movements hesitant, her expression showing the strain of being in the public eye again. She stood at the microphone, visibly trembling. "I'm not here to make excuses," she said, her voice barely audible at first, then growing stronger. "I'm here because President Traoré taught me something important. Accountability requires facing the people you've harmed, not hiding from them. A year ago, I was unconsciously racist. Today, I'm working every day to unlearn lifetimes of bias. That work will never be finished." She turned toward Ibrahim, who stood to the side of the stage. "President Traoré, I cannot undo what I did, but I want you to know that your response, your dignity, your insistence on seeing this as a teaching moment rather than just seeking revenge, changed my life. You didn't have to give me the gift of your grace, but you did. I'm trying to be worthy of it." Ibrahim stepped forward. For a long moment, he simply looked at Jessica, his expression unreadable. The crowd held its collective breath, wondering how he would respond. Finally, he spoke. "Ms. Hartwell, you have done something that many people never do. You have genuinely examined yourself, confronted uncomfortable truths, and committed to change. That is not easy. It is actually the hardest work humans can do." He paused. "I do not forget what happened. The humiliation, the disrespect, those memories remain. But I also recognize that you are not the same person who kicked my suitcase across that cabin. You have done the work. You have served others. You have tried to learn." He extended his hand. "I cannot offer you forgiveness. That is not mine alone to give. But I can offer you recognition of your effort and hope for your continued growth." Jessica took his hand, tears streaming down her face. The handshake lasted several seconds, and in that contact, something significant passed between them. Not absolution exactly, but acknowledgement, mutual respect earned through hard paths traveled. The crowd erupted in applause. Some people cried. Others simply stood in silence, recognizing they'd witnessed something important. Two people, connected by a terrible moment, finding a way forward that honored both justice and mercy, accountability and possibility. Years later, the incident on Flight 401 remained a case study in business schools, training programs, and ethics classes around the world. It had become a touchstone for discussions about implicit bias, dignity, leadership under pressure, and the possibility of genuine change. Ibrahim Traoré continued leading Burkina Faso, navigating the complex challenges of governance in a rapidly changing world. He never achieved celebrity status again, which suited him fine. He'd never wanted fame, just respect for his nation and its people. Jessica Hartwell became a respected social worker and advocate for refugee rights. She never tried to capitalize on her infamy, never wrote a book or sought speaking fees. She simply did the work, day after day, helping people whom others overlooked or dismissed. Colleagues who knew her story marveled at her transformation. Those who didn't know it simply saw a dedicated professional with unusual empathy for the people she served. The video Diego recorded had been viewed hundreds of millions of times. It remained on the internet, a permanent record of both the worst and best of human behavior. The casual cruelty of prejudice, yes, but also the power of dignity in the face of that cruelty, the courage of witnesses who spoke up, and the possibility of people changing when confronted with truth. Sometimes, in quiet moments, people who had been on that flight would think back to those hours at 30,000 feet. They remembered the fear they'd felt, witnessing such blatant injustice. They remembered the relief when others finally spoke up. They remembered the revelation that transformed the cabin from a space of privilege into something more profound, a classroom where everyone learned important lessons about respect, assumptions, courage, and grace. But perhaps the most important legacy was the countless other moments the incident influenced. Times when someone paused before making a snap judgment based on appearance. Instances when witnesses found courage to speak up instead of looking away. Opportunities when people chose understanding over anger. And moments when the powerful remembered that their position demanded humility rather than arrogance. The silent triumph was this: dignity once witnessed has a way of spreading. Like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, it moves outward, touching shores invisible from where it began. And somewhere over the Atlantic, aircraft still flew at 30,000 feet, carrying passengers who had no idea that their journey followed a path made slightly better by one man's refusal to let prejudice define his response, and one woman's hard-won willingness to learn from her worst moment. The sky remained vast and infinite, but the world below had changed, if only by degrees, made a bit more just, a bit more aware, a bit more willing to see each person not for what they appeared to be, but for who they truly were. That was Ibrahim Traoré's real victory. Not in the apology he received, not in the fame that followed, but in the quiet transformation of countless hearts that witnessed dignity triumph over hate, and chose to carry that lesson forward into their own lives. And that, perhaps, is how the world actually changes, not through grand declarations or sweeping reforms alone, but through individual moments when people decide that how they treat others matters, that dignity is universal, and that the true measure of a person is revealed not in positions of power, but in how they navigate spaces where power might seem absent. The story of Flight 401 ended not with a conclusion, but with a continuation, countless stories yet to be written, in which the lessons learned at 30,000 feet would find new expression in ground-level encounters between human beings who had to choose, every day, between judgment and understanding, between indifference and courage, between prejudice and respect. The choice, as it always has been, was theirs to make. The end.